My name's Mark Shenton. I'm a GP by trade. I'm a CCG clinical chair in Ipswich in East Suffolk, so the eastern part of the country. And more recently, I've been taken up an academic position at a brand new Academy of Integrated Care that's hosted by the University of Suffolk, but it's actually a partnership academy, between the integrated care system of Suffolk and North East Essex, Suffolk County Council, the university, and Healthwatch in Suffolk. So it was set up in response to the growing requirement for integration, and what does that actually mean? Because, you know, in my own view, integration isn't organizations coming together and working, it's the people of the organizations coming together and working, and how do we help them do that easily? That's the big challenge, and I think that's part of the challenge we've set ourselves in the Integrated Care Academy. One of the elements is around workforce and leadership development. So shall we go into the slide set? So I've actually titled it Leaving Egypt, which is where the Egypt bit came in the flyer that went out. Because we actually use the allegory of leaving Egypt and going to the promised land when we talk about change in our transformation program and change program. And leaving Egypt is really difficult. People find it really difficult, don't they? And therefore, what can we do to help them leave, but also help them transition to that promised land? And if we go to the next slide, and you know, if we think about Egypt can become an incredibly difficult place to be, yet we still don't actually want to leave it. And even as leaders, we don't see the requirement that actually we've got to leave ourselves. So when it comes to thinking about how we support our teams change, we've also got to think about it for ourselves, why we don't make that easy for ourselves or for our workforce that we work for, or the people who use a service where a service has to change. What have we got to do to support them with what's going to come on? And actually, when we look at change, I think it's estimated that 95% of change that we work in doesn't actually provide improvement. And if that's the case, why would we expect change to occur as a consequence? So just a little cartoon to reflect that from a Moses story. So if we go on to the next slide. So this is just a little bit about me in terms of where I've come from and my own journey around change and development of leadership. And the building on the left is the practice that I work in. And in 1997, we set about changing it from a flat roof group practice of about 800 square meters to what we have now, which is about just under 4,000 square meters, a large partnership in the center of a building that has mental health services, child development center, a family support unit, hospital outpatients. We have chemotherapy and blood transfusion going on. We have conference rooms. We have our community service, nursing team, health visitors, school nurses, all within this building. And just because people come into a building doesn't mean that they actually ever work together or talk to each other. So how do you go about designing a building that supports teams interacting, and that was one of the first projects I was given as a new partner back in 1997 to try and help sort out, alongside the all the technicalities as well. And I'm going to share with you at the end of the discussion today a few techniques that I've used and constantly use, just some simple things that try to help ensure that teams are included in all of the decisions that we make and the work of change. The top right building is the council offices in Suffolk, Endeavour House, where we've got, again, lots of multidisciplinary teams, multi-agency teams working in there. And the bottom one is the University of Suffolk on the waterfront, and we've got a new building coming up behind it, which will have the Integrated Care Academy in it. And whilst all these buildings are really fantastic and amazing to be involved in how they operate and how they come together, integration in teams isn't about structures and buildings. It's about how people are well led, they're well coordinated, remain knowledgeable, and really stay on track with the common purpose that they have. So if we move on to the next slide. And in terms of leadership, this was a place in Australia where I worked in 1993. Gosh, going back even further. As in my fourth year out of medical school, and on the right-hand side you can see the Queensland map and a little red indicator, and that's where this town was. It's called Mount Isa. And it has one of the biggest mines in the world. And we worked in a very small base hospital there, where there was about 2 consultants. There were 2 principal house officers. I was one of them on the surgeon side, and my wife was the other one on the medical side. And we had a few junior house officers who were fresh out of medical school, about 5 of them. And just to put a bit of context on the map, Townsville on the right-hand side on the Coral Sea there was 980 kilometres away from Mount Isa, and that was our nearest main hospital. Brisbane, which was our tertiary hospital, was about 2,500 kilometres away, and the area that we were covering was about the size of England and Wales and about half of Scotland. So we were probably in Bury or Rochdale, in the equivalent of the British Isles, and so that really helped hone your leadership skills and thinking of how a team would work and what you might need to do to make sure that everything worked competently. So a great time. I'm glad it was 6 months of my life there. It was an amazing time, but it helped really cement leadership, particularly in my mind, coming back to the UK. So we go on to the next slide. So when we're thinking about change, change is always optional. But as Edward Deming, who's one of my great heroes, the father of total quality management, said, it's not necessary to change, survival isn't mandatory. So we've got to somehow understand how we make change happen in positive ways for people, so that we do continue to survive, that we do continue to provide excellent services or excellent products that people want or need. So if we move on. And the consequence of not doing change, I think, is sort of summed up in these three cartoons. I love the left one, is one of my favorites. So rather than actually realizing that something needs to change, we do everything we can in our powers to create excuses as to why we could do something else that will perpetuate what we're doing and not drive change that we actually need to see. So the Dakota Indian, when you discover you're riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. I'm sure we can all think of loads of examples in our professional careers where we've been caught up in the middle of that. And the consequence of this is very much described by Boris Johnson on the bottom right-hand side. It's a constant drain of our energy. It always feels like we're going uphill. It's exhausting, it drains us. And on the top right-hand side, Gavin Williamson and the Prime Minister asking themselves, well, what have we learned? You know, what have we learned from our history? What have we learned from not actually just getting on and making a decision about changing what we're going to do and make something really positive of it? And if we move on to the next slide. So there's a number of things that I thought is always useful to remind ourselves about when we start thinking about change, and starting with why is always a good place to start, because often we actually jump to, okay, who's going to do it? When are they going to do it by? What are they going to do? Rather than thinking, why are we going to do this? And who can help me understand why? I think there's something about asking why, which is really, really childish, which might sort of explain why we don't use the question enough. But I think it is the most important question, because if you can't answer it, it really does challenge our thinking about, well, what's the point? What is the purpose? There's a technique we'll talk about a bit later called Kaizen, which is about 5 whys. Ask yourself why 5 times, and by the time you've got to the 5th why, you've probably got your answer as to what's going on. And I think it's a really good, useful thing to deploy. And control, I think, is an incredibly important issue. Control for us as people who are leading change, but also control for people who are following you and having to come on the journey with you. My experience, because that's where I've got my professorship, by the way. I'm not an academic. I don't have any letters after my name apart from my primary degree. My professorship is based on my experience. My experience tells me that there are 3 things that people want from their working life. They want to have a balance between their work and their living. They want to feel that they can apply and have control over their professional standards, and that they want to feel rewarded, which is about getting pounds and pence, but also about feeling that they've done a really good job every day. And I think if we keep just those 2 things, asking why and thinking about the control in mind, we'll stand a much better chance of helping people understand why Egypt might not be the place they need to be, and what they might need to do to be able to move on. And just a couple of additional things in there. One is beware the mission creep. Don't start by asking why and creating the purpose and then change it after you've decided that, without thinking of everybody else who's created that purpose of change in the first place. And the second bit is really about how you do that inclusive whole team approach to understanding what the problem is. Because if you just do it yourself, all you'll see is your viewpoint of what the change needs to be. And you won't be able to consider the whole aspect. So it won't be a shared vision of what's going to come, and nor will it be shared around what the solutions are going to actually be and what the transition needs to support. So we move on to the next slide. And so this again comes back to the Egypt to the promised land, and the phases of transition that we have to go through, because the change is just what happens at the end. The transition is the bit that helps us go from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. And it's really important that when we're looking at where we are now, we consider the current baseline. And if we're going to get that baseline right, you know, what needs to end, what do we need to do to make it happen, what works now, and what can we build on? We do need to be inclusive about that. And we also need to understand why we're in that position and the backstory behind it. And if we know who to ask to help us define the backstory, we will then also know who we need to include in helping us leave Egypt and move into the wilderness. And in terms of the promised land, you know, that question, if you knew you are going to be really successful, I think is something that helps to inspire people to think about what that future looks like. Because if it's something that you create, it could be way off the mark. And in the story of leaving Egypt, of course, it was the promised land was full of milk and honey. Well, that might, for some people, be lots of bees and stingy things and cows that eat the products and leave a hell of a mess behind. So having that shared vision of what the promised land looks like, I think, is really important. And then in the neutral zone, the wilderness, looking at the things of control, the understanding, the support, the purpose really helps if we've done that bit in the planning to help people make that first step. As Mao said, you know, 1,000-mile journey starts with that first step. If you don't do the first step, you're not going anywhere. So let's help the transition. So we move into the next slide. So I just thought we'd have a bit of fun thinking about the traps along the way of transition. And here's poor old Lester and Willie getting caught out as the unintended consequence of Moses helping his people across the Red Sea. So, you know, what are the unintended consequences that might come along? How do we plan for them? How do we not stay dogmatic to the plan, but think of it as being something on which we constantly improve as we go along? And of course, poor old Moses took 40 years to get across his wilderness. You know, if our transition is 40 years, I think we'll lose the dressing room and nothing will change before we've all retired. So not much different to normal then. So let's not make our working life the transition. Let's help people get to the promised land and use the support and the knowledge of our really talented people who can do that. And good old Moses' wife finding someone who could actually find the way to where they were looking. So next slide, please. And just to continue the theme, if we're thinking about what sustains us during transition, is it palatable? Is it something that we would hope for? You know, manna from heaven, yeah, but have we ever tasted manna? I'm not sure. And if we're going to make rules along the way, who's making them? Who says so? And is it all right that these new things come on? How do we sustain the inclusive approach as we walk across the wilderness? And the next slide. So which sort of doesn't really build a great hope for our ability to do change. Lots of things to have to think about. And so when it comes to resistance, there's lots of reasons why people naturally resist change. You know, it raises all sorts of uncertainty. There's surprise, surprise. Maybe you didn't know, but here we are. We're off again. it can cause all sorts of emotions to rise. People feeling like they lose control, then it really is a torrid time. If people feel that what they've been providing you now is no longer of value, they feel that they've lost face, that their competency isn't good enough, that there's about to be a whole load of new work and new learning, and that actually that change may represent a real threat to somebody's working life, their job. And so naturally we get the fear, and this cartoon of mice building their own trap is I thought was a great little reflection of Stockholm syndrome. For those of you who know Stockholm syndrome, it's where hostages develop a psychological bond with their captors during captivity. And we develop our own psychological bond with our own status quo. So when that's under threat, our first thought is not about, oh, how nice this might be. It's, how do I maintain the status quo? And that hinders people wanting to change, but it also probably helps prevent us as leaders wanting to lead for change, because with the next slide, if we're looking into the face of our people we're leading and we stare, find this staring back at us, that will naturally make us feel incredibly anxious about what we're about to do, and how we're about to step away from what we're doing, and take that step into the transition phase towards change. And it's natural, we're human. These are very strong emotions in us. That there are survival moments, aren't they? They're very much chips in us that come to the fore, because that's just what human is being about. It's about being survival. And going back to that previous slide about, if you move forward, but the slide about change not being optional, survival not mandatory, it actually flies in the face of what we're presented with in this way. So if we move on to the next slide, and Alexander Graham Bell provides this quotation, and most of us, I would have thought all of us will know that first bit, when one door closes, another door opens. But actually the rest of the quotation is much more uncomfortable. Yet we look so long and so regretfully upon the closed door, we do not see the one which is opened for us. And so all of that opportunity, we are so drawn to where we start from and what we're used to, that even if there's great opportunity where we might not see where we want to go. And that's where our leadership comes to the fore. So if we go on to the next one, I've got this trust equation from an article provided by a group called the Army Leader. And early in COVID, NHS England commissioned the Army Leader to provide a handbook for leading through crisis. I thought, I'll have a look at this thing. And then I went on to the Army Leader website, and actually there were a couple of articles that really stole the show for me. One was called The Future of Command and Control. And the other one was called Be the Jazz Band, Not the Orchestra. And it was about leadership in teams. And the Future of Command and Control had this trust equation in it. And it just really chimed with me about not just trust from us of our teams, but also looking back, trust in us by our teams. And this is a two-way equation that I think that we can use, because it's trust and being trustworthy, I think, that helps us as leaders have that bond with our team in a very positive way. And again, I'm sure you can think of lots of things that you've done or observed where this trust equation has been quite important. If we look at just the stuff going on around MPs at the moment and the trust that we have in them about their integrity and their intentions and that moral courage. If we think about how we've had to operate as clinical teams over COVID, trying to make decisions around people's lives and the planning that went in around how we might react if services became overwhelmed, and how would we maintain our integrity and intent as clinical leaders with a workforce who may have felt overwhelmed at times. I think it really does help for me describe why just focusing on how good are we, that capability and the ability to drive results is just nowhere near good enough. It's part of the equation, but it's not all of it. And the integrity and intent is so important in terms of building trust, because trust is very difficult to build, but it's very easy to lose. And so being open and honest about all of these elements is really important. And the trust equation in the Army Leader was about how you can develop and what you need to develop with your team, who on the front line have to make changing decisions on a day-to-day basis according to the situation they find themselves in. And if we think about our clinical teams, the best person to make a decision about what's going to happen to a patient is that clinician at that time, being able to have the knowledge of what to do, the information about what's happening, and to be able to deploy a resource that makes a difference to that patient. And how do we as leaders and managers within the service allow that to happen at that point of care in a very well-led, well-coordinated way that saves time and saves lives, really. So I found it a very inspiring read. If we go on to the next slide. So I just thought I'd share a few examples of techniques that I've used in my leadership journey. The Kaizen is one that probably used the most, and I think is really great to help frontline teams take control of improvement. And so if we start thinking of change being a really anxiety driving issue for teams, and we want to leave them alone and not give them anxiety for change, how can we actually make change something that is part of normal life, and therefore when we come to doing some of our bigger changes, it's more acceptable and people are more in a frame of mind to manage it, because it's not alien, and it is part of how they want to work, because they see the change as being an improvement activity, not just something that is structurally going to be different. And so Kaizen, one example I've got is in our practice. We have what we call our Kaizen board, which is a little bit based on the Honda advert, hate something, change something. So if any member of staff is dealing with something in their working day where they just go, I wish I didn't have to do that, they could just put it on the board and describe what it is that has bugged them and got in the way of them actually being able to do the work that they wanted to do that day. And everyone has the right to put it on. You just have to be able to describe it so somebody reading it can understand what you mean. And when you start getting brave on this, people actually put their names next to it, so that there's clarification, and they're quite happy to do that once they get starting using it. And when the board fills up, so don't make it too big a board, you sit down and have a discussion about it. And as a partner, we would have a partner in the room with all of our staff representatives to talk about each of the lines that have been brought up, and ask ourselves, why did that happen? And do the 5 whys. And through that, make recommendations to the rest of the workforce, rest of the partners, the team doing the work, about what we would do about it, so that we didn't have to hate that again, because it wouldn't be there. And it's a very good, well-respected way of working. Sorry, what have you in there? I have to go to my right. Okay, thank you, Caroline. If we move on to the next one, offers and wants is a really good way of getting 2 teams who are coming together in partnership to think about, not stop making assumptions about each other and get down to some good old facts about what they're offering and what they're wanting. And this is a way for 2 teams to quickly come to a conclusion about what the matches are between them, and what is missing, and that they need to spend some time on bridging, or where there are some clashes, trying to work through what those issues are. So you don't spend all of your time agreeing with each other, you spend your time on the issues that need some resolution. And so it really does come down to, what does A offer B? What does A want from B? And the other way around. And you can quite easily and quite quickly come to see where you are. We use this as a practice in looking at whether we wanted to join in forming a super partnership, not just being Stowe Health, but being part of super partnership Suffolk Primary Care. And as partners with our managers, we worked through this and came to a very confident conclusion that we wanted to be part of Suffolk Primary Care, because we thought it was going to offer what we wanted. And 5 years down the line, it still is what we would want to do. We have also used this as commissioners working with our providers, where we might have got into bunker situations where we're making assumptions about each other and about the way a contract is working. And what we want to do is get out of the bunker and start talking about what needs resolution. And found it a very helpful methodology. And if we move on, another one. I call this Daisy and Bessy statements because I just remember this from doing a bit of training in Deming work, continuous quality improvement. But I couldn't find the reference for it, so I can't tell you what the formal name is. But I used this one in practice again, but used it in many other forums, but one where we were incredibly stressed as a group of practitioners. Our staff were really stressed because we were finding it very difficult to manage the workload and the way that it was coming into the practice and being managed. So we used about 4 pieces of flip chart paper and just put a big question in the middle of it, which was, what causes you stress? and a whole load of sticky notes, and just said to the staff and partners, just tell us what it is, all the elements, everything within the working day that is giving you problem. It's, I suppose, a bit like Kaizen, but much broader, around a single question. And after about 2 weeks, we had quite a lot of sticky notes on, and then you just group them together in terms of the theme that they're telling you, create a bridging statement that, you know, if people were to peel back the sticky notes, they'd be able to see that it all made sense, the bridging statement on the top. And then you can start seeing where all the common themes are and sources of the issue. And more than that, you can start to then see, because you're starting to see the wood amongst the trees, you can start seeing which are upstream and which are downstream effects, that if you then decide to make a change happen, you know where you want to put your focus on first. And if you do get a win on that particular area, you find that the downstream effects are that other things get knocked over as a consequence of doing that one change. The change it inspired in our practice was a complete and utter change to the appointment system, to becoming a demand-led system, rather than one that created waiting times, and one that also developed a completely separate and separately managed long-term condition service that was able to then systematically approach about 40% of the work that we were doing, which made managing the demand-led side much more easy for the clinicians in that space, and develop multidisciplinary teams that were able to look at and manage the workload between them and create clinical support. So if we go on to the final slide, these are just some of the success factors I think that we've been talking about on the way in, but really I think are an output as a consequence of taking the steps that we've been talking around. So compassionate leadership style, I think, is incredibly important. Command and control has no place in this formulation of change in a day-to-day business. Command and control, of course, will have its place, but nowhere near the quantity that may be being used. So compassionate leadership style, I think it's I'm thinking it's Michael West who has promoted this within the NHS, attending, understanding, empathy, and taking intelligent action. And it's a very intensive form of leadership, but it's a very rewarding one. And Edward Deming says, where there is fear, there is always wrong numbers. You're much more likely to get the truth about what's actually happening through the use of this leadership style. And we spoke earlier about culture. If we don't get the culture right, it doesn't matter what our strategy is, it'll be eaten before it gets to deployment. And if we think about we have strategy, we then have tactical and operational deployment. We have the interpersonal level, which is where the teams start doing that interaction. And we have below that the culture. What is it that we aspire to? How is it that it will be done, that will make the difference, and really embed change that is meaningful for people. In God we trust, all else bring data, says Edward Deming. So use the facts, as we've been saying, be inclusive, and then we'll get all the facts together. And creating a listening environment. Nancy Klein, I don't know if people are familiar with her work, the quality of our thinking depends on the way we treat each other while we are thinking. And we can make time to think. And it's so important that we do appreciate the value of it, because it doesn't have to be very long. It can just be 2 minutes each way. For those of you familiar with thinking pairs, or a thinking circle, that could probably only take about 20 minutes of time to sort through a problem. Very valuable, and a huge amount of value in that. So investing in that time for learning every day is part of the 5 ways to well-being. Why wouldn't we want to do it? Because when we have teams that listen and learn, they become creative, they want to invent things, they want to adopt innovation and make it adaptable to the needs that they have. And why wouldn't we want that? And finally, be prepared. As Eisenhower said, plans are worthless, planning is everything. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. So having a plan is great until someone punches you in the mouth, is Mike Tyson's version of that. And so by all means, have the plan, but always be prepared to change the plan at the right moment, and with the right support. And I think we've come to the end of our diatribe from me, and opportunity to have a real conversation about it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much. That was incredibly interesting. Any questions from the audience?
Can't surely have just stunned you into silence.
Yeah, could I ask a question, Mark?
Of course you can.
And it might be putting you a bit on the spot, what was the most difficult, if you had the top 3 most difficult things that, in terms of implementing that change, what would those be for you in your experience with what you were trying to do?
So I think the biggest challenge we've got at the moment is inverting the hierarchy triangle, which I think is so fundamental in how integrated care systems are going to work. So just getting people to look at the way that they're looking things through the other lens. So if you think about looking through a set of binoculars or a telescope or a microscope, we always tend to focus down on the detail of what we're doing. And if we actually turn it round and see the broader picture, the inverting the triangle is getting people to think about the most senior leader as not the top of the patch telling everybody what to do, but is at the bottom of the triangle, supporting everyone being able to do what they're set out, what their job description is to deliver.
I've actually seen a chart, somebody had actually done that, where you've got the frontline workers at the top, and it's a really powerful thing, actually.
Yes.
Really makes you think.
Yes, and we're teaching that through a program which we call the One Team program within the Integrated Care Academy, and that is part of that now, because I think it's vital that people see their role as being different in this new world. It's not the same with a different name on the top. It is actually different, both in terms of the construct and what it's there to do in the way of how it goes about doing it. So I think if people struggle to get that, it's going to be difficult to cement the change that we really need to see.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions for Mark?
can't believe it's such a quiet bunch.
I
There's definitely questions out there.
I have sometimes have a tendency to be the one who does all the talking. Sorry, but
Yeah.
and just the culture thing's really interesting, isn't it? And the quotes there, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I used to work with a guy called Chris Forrest, who's Chris Forrest Consultancy. He's an OD specialist, and he was doing some work with us, and he said something very interesting, which I've always remembered. He said, we will not change the culture of an organisation. Our job is to create the conditions for the people to do that themselves. And it's something that, we've just formed the NCA by bringing some organisations together, and we've started to use the phrase NCA family a lot, which is, a good attempt to try and start to create a feeling, isn't it? To try and create a culture. But for me, it's, well, what are we actually going to do to help people start to feel that? So that statement, that phrase becomes something that they genuinely feel is a reality.
Yeah, and there's something in there about another phrase, assume positive intent. And a lot of the time we don't. We go around with our assumptions rather than hoping what it might be, rather than negative limiting assumptions. The one I remember from my Deming training was people don't come to work and hang up their brains with their coat. How is it that we allow all that knowledge to come through? As you say, is it about whose culture are we talking about changing here? A lot of the time I've heard that the middle managers who, the squeezed middle being referred to as the damp proof course through which nothing ever goes down and nothing ever comes up. Is that true? Or is it the fact that actually they've got a lot different targets to manage themselves and they're just not interested in that? How do we drive the way the system works to get the outcomes that we really want, using all of the resources we have available to us, rather than just assuming that this will or will not happen, or it will happen because I've said so, which is the oft used way in many public services. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. Diane.
So it's not really a question, it's more of a kind of observation thing, apart from the fact that I loved all your slides because they brought everything to life. The theories in the pictures were great for me. And whilst, and it's very interesting that you're talking about the East of England, because that's part of the area that I sit in, so that's really helpful. And I've made lots of notes to give to my colleague who will cover the SNE area, so that's great. But there was a couple of tools that seemed to work in there for the big pieces of work. So even things like STPs to ICS movements, huge pieces of work that will be going on, but also in our own team, we have created lots of different, finally, we have a team that has, quite a few people in it, which is great, but there's kind of this level, and then there's this level, and then there's this level, and actually we need to be all mashed together, because I can't do what I need to do without you supporting me, but you need to know what I need the support with and all that kind of stuff. So just that simple kind of offers and wants seemed like a really simple way, because we're all, you can hear it, ready to fall over. There's such a lot of work to do, as is the place everywhere, but nobody can seem to get to the nub of why, what, where and when. And you kind of think just something that simple, or that virtual, here's a big piece of paper, stick your, I'm not happy with this, so I'm not happy with this, what was it, hate something, change something, or whatever. Those seem like, quite simple little snappy things to say, but they could have a massive impact, couldn't they? So I think I've really enjoyed it, but I think I'm going to take several things away, and those small changes might help to make those bigger changes further down that line, mightn't it? So yeah, really appreciate you putting this on. It's been really good. Thank you.
No problem. No, I'm a firm believer that if you recruit people to work in your team, you value them for what they bring, not just for what they do. And the consequence is that they grow. You know, if we're talking about culture, if we're talking about culture from a medical perspective, it's something which helps something grow. That's what I would like to see as culture. It's how we support each other, all of us growing in a positive way. Of course, some cultures just kill everything off, don't they? But we don't want to be like that.
No, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everybody for coming. It's been such an interesting talk, and definitely some of the quotes that you've pulled out really resonated. And thank you very much. I'll post a few contact details in the chat, but I think I'll stop recording for now. And thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye for now.